They thought they were humiliating the new secretary, but I was the one holding their careers in my hands. I should have known the way they looked at me would set the tone for the week. That curious mixture of pity and superiority, the way people glance at someone they've already decided is beneath them. I'd spent the last 10 years in boardrooms where the glances were just as sharp, but they were usually accompanied by rehearsed smiles and power suits worth more than my first car. Here, in the cramped reception area of Westford and Kane, the smiles were thinner, the lighting harsher, and the clothes cheaper, but the condescension was exactly the same. "You must be our new secretary," a tall man with gelled hair said, as if introducing me to the concept of my own existence. "We'll get you set up, eventually." I nodded, clutching my small handbag like it was the only anchor I had in this fluorescent-lit sea. Inside, I was already filing away names and faces. Years as a CEO had taught me that arrogance always revealed itself quickly, and arrogance, when paired with a lack of self-awareness, was almost too easy to dismantle. They didn't know, of course, that this was my company, that I'd acquired Westford and Kane 6 months ago, quietly folding it into my portfolio of smaller subsidiaries to observe a very specific problem. A toxic middle management culture that had been bleeding talent for years. My board wanted data. I wanted something more personal. I wanted to look into the eyes of the people who had turned a once promising office into a revolving door of resignation letters, and I wanted to see what they would do when they thought no one was watching. "Don't worry," said a woman in a floral blouse that didn't match her perfume. "We'll break you in easy." Her smile was the kind you give someone before pushing them into the deep end. The first morning was a carousel of petty humiliations. My desk phone rang every few minutes with nonsensical requests. Coffee orders for people who weren't in the office, messages for imaginary clients, print jobs that mysteriously jammed halfway through. By lunchtime, someone had switched the sugar in the break room with salt. The laughter when I took a sip was not subtle. I didn't let them see the small smile that crept across my face. There's a certain satisfaction in knowing you are playing a longer game than anyone else in the room. The real world doesn't often hand you the opportunity to be the fly on the wall and the hand that swats it in one. Day 2 brought the ringleader into sharper focus. His name was Darren, mid-30s, crisp white shirts, loud laugh. The kind of man who mistook cruelty for charisma. He was the one who, accidentally, sent me on a delivery to the wrong floor, who corrected my pronunciation of a client's name in front of a full conference room, who winked at the others whenever I made the smallest misstep. What Darren didn't realize was that I had read his file long before I ever stepped foot into this office. Sales manager. High performer, according to quarterly reports. Low retention in his team. 3 HR complaints in the last year that went nowhere. The kind of employee who could charm his way upward while leaving scorched earth in his wake. I began to notice his lieutenants, 2 younger men who laughed a beat too quickly at his jokes, a woman in marketing who rolled her eyes when he wasn't looking but never spoke up. The hierarchy was clear, and it was built on fear disguised as camaraderie. My own fear, I decided, would be my weapon. Not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that lulls the predator into thinking they've already won. On day 3, I let my voice shake when I asked for clarification on a task. I made a deliberate typo in an email, knowing Darren would seize the chance to mock me. He didn't disappoint. "Guess spell check isn't your friend yet," he said loudly, and the room tittered like obedient schoolchildren. I looked down, feigning embarrassment, while inside I was tightening the net. That same afternoon, he helped me carry a stack of folders, then deliberately let one slip so papers scattered across the floor. He laughed as I bent to pick them up, and I could feel the smugness radiating off him like heat. I didn't react. I wanted him to believe I was made of thin glass, one more bump away from shattering. I didn't have to wait long for my first unexpected ally. Her name was Lila. Early 60s, silver hair pulled into a low bun, eyes that had seen more than she ever said out loud. She worked in accounting, and she didn't join in the laughter. "You'll figure it out," she told me in the elevator, her voice low but steady. "Just keep your head down." There was a story behind that tone, but I didn't ask. Not yet. Allies reveal themselves slowly in places like this. By the fourth day, the jokes escalated into theatrics. I returned from lunch to find my desk covered in sticky notes, each with a mocking reminder about simple tasks. Don't forget to breathe. Use the phone to make calls. Paper goes in printer. The laughter was deafening. And that was when I decided it was time to move the timeline forward. Originally, I had planned to stay undercover for 2 more weeks, gathering more first-hand accounts. But there's a certain look people get when they've convinced themselves they're untouchable, and Darren's eyes had it in spades. That afternoon, I stayed late. Not to finish work, but to plant the first seed of their undoing. I drafted an email to every employee in the office from a new address, corporate.oversight@buickholdingsandkane.com, with a simple message. A confidential employee culture review will be conducted next week. Attendance is mandatory. Please keep this internal. I knew the minute they saw corporate oversight, they'd start speculating. I wanted the paranoia to marinate overnight. The real fun, after all, was in the anticipation. The next morning, the air in the office was just slightly different. It wasn't obvious enough for anyone to call it tension, but you could feel it in the way conversations hushed when someone walked past, in the sidelong glances toward computer screens, in the barely suppressed curiosity that hummed under every polite greeting. I kept my head down, answering phones and filing paperwork, while my other hand was busy collecting data. Small reactions, who leaned toward whom for whispered updates, who avoided eye contact altogether. Darren strutted in 15 minutes late, holding a paper cup from the expensive cafe 2 blocks away, as if nothing in the world could touch him. He breezed past my desk without even acknowledging me, which was exactly what I wanted. You see, people like Darren rely on predictability. They build their power on an unspoken agreement. I humiliate you, you swallow it. Disrupt that pattern, and the cracks start to show. I caught him later in the break room talking to his 2 lieutenants. "Corporate oversight," he scoffed, taking a sip of his coffee. "Some bean counter from upstairs probably wants to tick a few boxes. I'll charm them like I always do." The younger one laughed too quickly, but there was a flicker in his eyes. Uncertainty. Darren didn't notice. People like him rarely see fear unless it's in a form they can exploit. My days were still peppered with petty sabotages, misfiled documents, accidental coffee spills. But I noticed something else too. The more they tried to rattle me, the more they watched for a reaction. And the more I gave them nothing, the more agitated they became. It's a strange kind of power, holding your composure while others twist themselves in knots trying to break it. On Wednesday, 2 days before the meeting, Darren cornered me at the copier. "You've been awfully quiet," he said, smiling in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "You're not scared of this big, scary meeting, are you?" "Should I be?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. His smile faltered for half a second. "Depends on how well you've been performing," he said, lowering his voice as if we shared a secret. "If they ask about you, I can Smooth things over. For a price. I let my eyes widen just enough to suggest fear. A price? Loyalty, he said, straightening up. And maybe a coffee every morning. He walked away without waiting for my answer, convinced he'd planted a seed of dependence. What he didn't realize was that I'd just confirmed something important. He thought the meeting was about evaluating individual employees, not the managers themselves. Perfect. Thursday was when I made my move. Not the full reveal, that would come later, but a small act of exposure. I stayed late again, sending a second corporate oversight email that subtly changed the wording. The culture review will focus on management practices and employee well-being. Direct feedback will be collected. I knew Darren would see it. I knew he'd panic. And panic, for men like him, always makes them sloppy. Friday morning, the office buzzed with nervous energy. Even the receptionist, who had avoided me all week, offered a tight smile. Darren was quieter than usual, glancing at his phone every few minutes. I caught him in his office, typing furiously, his jaw tight. Later, I would learn he'd been messaging his lieutenants to keep their stories straight. He was already building a defense to an attack that hadn't technically begun. That afternoon, Lila approached my desk. "You're stirring something up," she said, her voice so soft only I could hear. I looked at her, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you mean." She gave me a long, knowing look. "I've been here long enough to know when someone's not what they seem." My stomach tightened, not out of fear, but because I respected her enough to know she might be dangerous if she chose the wrong side. But then she added, "Whatever you're doing, make it count. People have been waiting for years for someone to stand up to him." That was the moment I decided Lila deserved the truth. Eventually. The weekend passed in quiet anticipation, at least for me. I imagined Darren spent it rehearsing his charm, perfecting the narrative in which he was the misunderstood leader, the victim of overblown complaints. I'd seen that story play out in countless companies before, and it always fell apart when the storyteller was caught off guard. Monday arrived like a drumbeat. I was in the conference room 15 minutes early, dressed not in my usual soft cardigans and muted skirts, but in a tailored navy suit that sharpened every angle of my frame. I didn't bother with jewelry. Authority doesn't need adornment. One by one, employees filed in. Some looked curious, some anxious, a few openly resentful. Darren strolled in last, wearing a grin that felt like it had been stapled to his face. He glanced around as if expecting someone else to be at the head of the table. "Where's corporate oversight?" he asked, pulling out a chair. "You're looking at it," I said. The words landed like a stone in still water, ripples of confusion spreading outward until they collided with realization. I watched the shift in Darren's posture, the faint narrowing of his eyes. "What's this about?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "For the past week," I began, "I've been working here under the assumption that I was applying for a job as your secretary, but that was never the real interview." A murmur ran through the room. "This company," I continued, "has been losing talent at an alarming rate. Exit interviews tell one story, but experience tells another. I wanted to see for myself what the culture here was like. And now, I have my answer." I let the silence stretch. Darren shifted in his seat. The younger of his lieutenants looked down at the table, tapping a nervous rhythm with his fingers. "You're... what?" Darren said finally. "Your CEO," I said simply. It was the most satisfying 2 words I'd spoken in months. The color drained from his face. I slid a thick folder across the table. In here is a record of everything I've witnessed this week. The pranks, the public shaming, the atmosphere of fear you've cultivated. You've managed to turn colleagues into accomplices and talented employees into ghosts who walk out the door. Lila's gaze met mine, steady, almost proud. Effective immediately, I said, turning back to Darren. You're relieved of your managerial duties. You can choose to remain in a non-supervisory role pending an HR review, or you can hand in your resignation today. His jaw tightened. You can't just... I can, I interrupted. And I just did. The room stayed frozen for a moment, the weight of my words pressing down like a held breath. Darren's eyes darted between me and the folder as if it might spontaneously combust. His lieutenants shifted uncomfortably, clearly calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from him without looking disloyal. This is ridiculous, Darren said finally, his voice louder now, a touch of desperation leaking through the bravado. You come in here, pretend to be one of us, and then you think you can just... I didn't pretend to be one of you, I said, my tone level, almost quiet. I am one of you. I am an employer. I am the person responsible for ensuring that the people in this room can come to work without being undermined, harassed, or made the butt of someone's entertainment. And right now, you are the clearest example of why this office has been bleeding good talent for years. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Silence from everyone else confirmed that my point had already been made. Darren leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms like a teenager sent to the principal's office. Fine, I'll resign, he said sharply, as if quitting was a power move rather than a retreat. Make sure HR processes it by end of day. He stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, and stalked out. No one moved until the sound of his footsteps faded. Then there was a collective exhale, as if the oxygen level in the room had just increased. The rest of you, I said, looking around the table, will have individual meetings with me over the next week. We'll talk about what's been happening here, not just this week, but the months and years before. I want to hear your stories, and I want to make sure what happened here never happens again. I dismissed them, and they left in a slow trickle, some avoiding my gaze, others glancing at me with a mix of curiosity and relief. Lila was the last to leave. I knew you weren't just a secretary, she said, a small smile tugging at her mouth. I didn't know you were the CEO, but I knew you were here for something. I studied her for a moment. Why didn't you say anything? Because I've learned the hard way that sometimes the best way to help is to let someone work in the shadows until they're ready to step into the light. She paused. And I figured you'd know when that moment was. Over the next week, I had those one-on-one meetings. Some employees admitted they had joined in on the jokes because they feared becoming the next target. Others claimed they hadn't realized how bad it had gotten until they saw it from the outside. A few insisted they had kept their heads down and stayed neutral, failing to realize that neutrality in a toxic environment is its own kind of weapon. When I met with Lila, she told me about her decades in the company, about watching good people leave while the same patterns repeated. I thought about quitting, she admitted, but I needed the job, and I kept hoping someone would see what was happening. I saw, I said, and I intend to make sure it doesn't happen again. From there, I got to work. We established anonymous reporting channels that bypassed local management entirely. I hired an outside firm to conduct quarterly culture audits. We revised the anti-harassment policy to include microaggressions, passive-aggressive targeting, and public humiliation, not just overt threats. Leadership training became mandatory for anyone managing even one other person. And I made a point to bring in new hires who not only had the skills, but also the temperament to contribute to a healthy culture. Darren's departure left a visible void. At first, the office was quieter, as if everyone was waiting to see if I'd really changed things, or if the whole week had just been theater. But within a month, something shifted. The break room laughter became warmer, more inclusive. Collaboration actually meant helping, not finding ways to undermine someone's work. Lila's department started producing cleaner reports ahead of schedule. Even the receptionist, who had once treated me like an inconvenience, began greeting people with genuine warmth. I kept my physical presence in the office for several more weeks, still using the secretary's desk as my base. Part of it was logistical, transitioning the role to a new hire, but part of it was intentional. I wanted them to see that I wasn't above sitting at the front desk, answering phones, or handling the mundane. If leadership is only visible from the top floor, it stops being leadership and becomes something else entirely, detached authority. The day the new secretary started, I walked her through the systems personally. She was young, fresh out of school, eager to make a good impression. I gave her the advice no one had given me in my first week. "You'll be tested," I told her. "Some people will see your position as an easy target. Don't mistake their treatment of you as a reflection of your worth. And if something feels wrong, trust yourself enough to speak up." She nodded, absorbing every word. Lila stopped by my desk as I was packing up my things. "You didn't have to do all this yourself," she said quietly. "You could have sent someone to investigate." I smiled. "And missed all the fun?" Her laugh was soft, but there was pride in it. The truth was, there's no substitute for looking someone in the eye when they think you're powerless and showing them just how wrong they are. A few weeks later, I received an email from an employee in another department, one I hadn't interacted with directly. It read, "I don't know exactly what you did, but this place feels different. Thank you." I saved it in a folder labeled "Why I Do This." Months passed, and Westford and Kane's turnover rate dropped by nearly half. The board congratulated me on addressing operational inefficiencies, which was their polite way of acknowledging that I had rooted out a rot they'd only seen in numbers, not in faces. But I knew the real victory wasn't in the metrics. It was in walking into that office one last time and seeing Lila smiling, really smiling, over a cup of coffee, chatting with colleagues who no longer glanced over their shoulders before speaking. Sometimes the only way to change a place is to walk through its doors, not as the person in charge, but as the person everyone thinks they can push around. And sometimes the most powerful position in the room is the one they never see coming.